Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to today's Monday Majlis, which I hope will be a really fruitful and exciting conversation. As you've, I'm sure, noticed in the last few weeks, because it's Ramadan, I tend to finish these slightly earlier than normal, but today certainly we should be able to go through till about 6:20, which I hope will be enough time for the conversation. Um, It is a real pleasure to have Professor Kecia Ali with us today. Um, for those who are my students, you'll be familiar, if not generally familiar with her, quite simply because we do actually read a fair amount of her work in my MA class. Um, and for those who are not, I hope that this conversation will certainly inspire them to go off and read her work, if you haven't already done so, in the various fields that she works in. Um, I won't say much more because hopefully some of these things will emerge from the conversation. Just to say, welcome, Kecia. It's a real pleasure having you. Welcome to the Monday Majlis, and thank you for agreeing to do this conversation with me. Um, uh, so I should also say Kecia Ali is a professor of religion at Boston University. Let me just do one thing. And so let's make a start. And what I'll do, Kecia, is just welcome once again, and just ask you I guess the starting kind of question, which is if you could tell us a bit about your academic journey, or maybe not just your academic journey, but your journey in terms of how it is that you came to where you are today, and how you've um, grown into the field.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate this invitation to be here, and I'm delighted that folks have turned up. Whether you are, close to iftar and you are marshaling your last resources for concentration, or you're sort of in the middle of the day doldrums, like we are over on this side of the Atlantic, I appreciate it. And I hope you will extend me some grace if I'm a little more scattered than I would like to be. So I'm from Boston. I live in Boston. I've been in Boston much of my life. And it's been a sort of roundabout journey to start here and go a number of other places and come back around to moving here at the close of my dissertation process, and then ending up at Boston University, where I've been for going on 20 years now. I did not start out as a scholar of Islamic studies or religion. I did my undergraduate work in history, and although I took some classes on the Middle East and even an undergrad intro to Islam, I was actually focused on Latin America. And I thought I was probably going to write a dissertation about 20th century Brazil. But it was going to be about women and gender. I started in the graduate program in history at Duke and started taking Islamic studies classes kind of on the side. And then as it got closer to time to pick a dissertation topic, take exams, I ended up shifting over to the religion program and taking more coursework, and starting off really not quite from scratch, but definitely a lot further from the finish line than I had been. Why? Well, because it turned out that the questions I was really driven to research and to find answers to had to do with the way Muslims were talking about gender. And in a lot of ways, actually, the work that I'd done on Latin America, on 19th and 20th century Latin America, clued me into a particular kind of Victorian, modern way of talking about gender and talking about gender complementarity and talking about angel of the hearth type stuff. And I thought, gee, really, as a historian, this is stuff I know from the 19th century, from the mid 20th century. To assume that this is authentic 7th century Islamic gender norms just seems suspect to me. And so I started doing research on gender in Islamic history. I started doing research on Quran interpretation. And this is in the 1990s, right, which was a really flourishing, exciting time for scholarship about women and gender in Islam. And, Layla Ahmed had published her book, Amina Wadud had published her book, and all of a sudden people are doing all this really fascinating research. And I was thrilled and excited and really drawn in. Um, and then, this is to anticipate a little bit the story of this book that I'm here to talk about. I discovered that outside of the people who were already committed to working on women and gender, people just weren't reading it or talking about it or taking it into account in their work. And so the field was wide open in terms of the research that I wanted to do, ultimately on early Islamic law, but also just lots and lots of places where talking about women in Muslim history um, wasn't happening, and I wanted to see it happen, and all the places where it was happening in really exciting ways, and I wanted to share that excitement.
Yeah,
And ultimately, that led me here.
cool. Yeah, I mean, I guess it is a feature of those times. I mean, I remember as an MPhil student starting out, we were required to read Layla Ahmed and Barbara Stowasser. Uh,
Yeah.
but although Amna Wadud's work was out, no one really thought of suggesting it.
Mhm.
Even though I think some people were familiar with it, uh, perhaps because it was something quite different. And of course, we now have a much larger literature, both theoretical, historical, as well as more kind of engaged. Um, so the field is quite different. And I guess in some ways, now if you were to teach a class, um, and some of us who do teach classes, which at least touch upon an aspect of gender, um, it's it's not something which comes across as being unusual for students.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of very good material that we can actually point students towards. So that's a real change in a relatively short period of about 25 years. But, yeah.
It is a change, and it also, I feel like the classroom is still catching up. It sounds like you do a good job in your modules, but I know that some of your colleagues did research about a decade ago looking at modules in UK universities, and found that the teaching about women and gender is very often, 1 week near the end of term,
Yeah,
right? And sort of segregated off from everything else. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how that's also still very often the case, for syllabi in US contexts.
yeah,
Less than it was maybe 20 years ago, but not substantially improved, in the way that one might expect, given the richness of the material that's available now, in contrast to the
yeah. And
90s.
I think that's definitely true, and perhaps also a greater awareness of some of that diversity of that material as well in terms of different sorts of training. So whether
Mhm.
people are trained in study of religion, or whether it's in law or history or philosophy or whatever, as well as different experiences from different parts of the world and different cultural contexts as well. And I think that's another you know question which often arises in these contexts when you're thinking about the what's often considered to be the sort of Arabic normativity of Islamic studies. And so it's always about looking at Arabic texts and those kind of contexts as being primary or at least fundamental and rule forming. And yet, in many ways, some of the more interesting material comes from beyond the Arabic context as well.
I mean, there's certainly enough interesting work and important work being done in Arabic or on Arab-speaking countries that one could profitably spend a whole semester there. But you're absolutely right that there is all this amazing work elsewhere that is very often treated as sort of supplementary or decorative. Sort of, you can get to it once you've got the basics, the core, the norm
Yeah,
down, right? If you like, it's sort of optional. In the same way that I think gender is often treated as optional.
yeah.
Right?
I
You
think
have to have Al-Ghazali, but if you're lucky, you'll get Nana Asma'u.
yeah, yeah. And I think that that question of the voices of representation. I remember having, for example, a conversation with a colleague about philosophy quite a while ago, and what kind of emerged was not a consideration of are there particular um, women philosophers, or at least women who are making philosophical arguments who one can engage with, um, but rather, looking at how it is that women are perceived in philosophical texts, which of course is a very different kind of question, and saying, well, there's more material in the philosophical traditions on that, and while I understand sometimes this argument about the limits of resources, I think partly the problem is we just don't make enough of an effort to look more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
We're quite used to the idea that yes, there will be some important, women Sufis who might be out there, but we don't necessarily look at the broader question of theology and philosophy in the same way, and that's I think in very many ways a kind of a shortcoming. I'm talking as someone who works primarily in the area of philosophy. It becomes a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that the two things sort of overlap, right? Um, there is a discussion to be had, right? Philosophical ideas about gender, the way that gender structures certain kinds of texts. And it's not just ideas about women, right? It's also ideas about men.
Yeah,
And what are norms of masculinity that often go unperceived as being gendered, right? They're just sort of how human beings are or should be. And I think it is more often, although not exclusively, right, people who aren't men who address those questions in their scholarship. So when you exclude those people, you exclude the scholarship on gender, and when you exclude the scholarship on gender, then you exclude those
sure.
people. And so there's a mutually reinforcing set of dynamics, right, around what constitutes not only the sort of real Islamic studies question and the real Islamic studies texts, but also then who are the real scholars doing this work.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we come to the book in a bit more detail, if I ask you that kind of more generic question, which we often ask our guests, which is if there's a particular piece of advice that you would give either our students or colleagues who are listening in to this majlis, anything that you really think is essential based on your experience in the field.
I'll say two things. One, um, notice, just pay attention. Um, who's on your syllabi, who's in your reading list, how are scholars positioning themselves, talking about things. You just pay attention. It doesn't have to be just to gender, but once you start noticing a particular thing, think about it, share it with others, because you have a particular set of lenses, and you can, the things that are obvious to you or that you begin to perceive aren't necessarily going to be obvious to everybody else, right? So that's number one. Number two is advice that's easy to give. And to my lasting regret, I mostly do not follow it myself, which is whenever you're writing something, write a sloppy first draft of the whole thing before you try to polish each of its constituent parts. I cannot tell you how often I have talks or chapters or books where, there's a really finely honed introductory paragraph, or 10 pages that are really careful and gripping and properly footnoted, and then things just trail off sort of into bullet points. So I would advocate hard for an iterative process where you try to get the whole thing out and then loop back around, so that you're not, polishing something that ultimately is going to have to be cut or moved around or whatever.
No,
It's great advice. When I have managed to do it, I'm always really glad. I don't always manage to do it.
I mean, to be honest, I've always had that intention, but it just never works out.
I
So,
wrote a book that way once. It was magical. Um, it
no,
was magical.
cool. Excellent. Um,
One book, one book, not this one.
I think partly sometimes it's also, especially with articles, it's a it's a function of time, especially when you're trying to meet something that you've promised someone. And yes, it'd be great to spend a bit more time in some ways to reflect and to write and then to kind of rewrite. But it doesn't, yeah, it doesn't always work out like that. So,
In my experience, it actually takes less time ultimately,
yeah, I
because
can see how it
you
works.
get the whole thing clear to some extent, as you loop back around. Your mileage may vary. Writing advice is always very idiosyncratic and personal, but when I have managed to do this, it has worked really well for me.
Okay, well let's move on to this particular book, which uh, the woman question in Islamic Studies, which came out with Princeton fairly recently. I think it was a few months ago, wasn't it?
September.
Yes. So if I start off by, I mean, you've already alluded to certain elements of it, but to just ask you the question about why it is that you felt the need to write this book and how you came to this book.
So I wrote the woman question because many scholars, especially women, not exclusively, have had work we've done or work our colleagues have done, um, just ignored in really relevant conversations, or appropriated without credit, or discussed with a level of vagueness that doesn't do justice to the scholarship involved. Sometimes I think these moments are malicious, but I think mostly it comes down to the norms and the habits that govern our collective work. In graduate school and beyond, we are encouraged by professors and by colleagues to read certain things, to cite certain things, to prioritize specific approaches, work, people, the must read book that we all must read and we all must cite. It's not generally a book by a woman. Scholarly work is supposed to move iteratively towards better and more accurate and more useful knowledge, but we're not doing that if we're not really paying attention to or substantively engaging or appropriately acknowledging a considerable proportion of what gets written. And that's where I think, sadly, we are as a field. So, what the woman question tries to do is show that practices of ignoring or downplaying scholarship by women and scholarship on gender are pervasive, insidious, and harmful, and also that they're structural, right? It takes aim at the way forms of exclusion are mutually reinforcing. So people don't get invited to be part of conferences, they don't get asked to contribute to collective publications, and then their work doesn't get read there, or it's less likely to be reviewed. Their publications don't make it onto comprehensive exam lists. And then, when we become faculty, those lists are the basis for our syllabi, and so they don't get assigned in classes, right? And the cycle continues. It's not just, one person didn't cite one thing in one article. It's that our professional defaults make it harder for some things to rise to folks' attention, right? So a peer reviewer doesn't mention an absence. The editor doesn't notice or doesn't care. Readers don't object. And so what I'm trying to do with this book is think about how we individually and collectively shift those default practices, right? And so it's not, although I do give specific examples, I'm happy to talk about why, it's not just particular things. It's sort of the path of least resistance, right? Leads us to centering men's scholarship. But another central point that the book makes is that just as the forms of exclusion that we find are mutually reinforcing, so also habits of working more inclusively move us from a vicious cycle to a virtuous circle, right? We spiral towards a more expansive and better functioning scholarly community. And I hope that that is true not only along axes of gender, but something I talk about a little bit in the book is other kinds of axes of inclusion, whether that's racial or whether it's global South, right? These are all things where I think that we can collectively, iteratively move towards more inclusive practices, both by changing some things about our own habits, and also by working to shift professional norms, right? I think it really, to focus exclusively on personal responsibility for these kinds of lapses actually reinforces this model of the lone genius, which itself is really kind of a pernicious habit.
I mean, it seems also that, there's, in some ways, there's two, that there are two ways in which this book is quite timely. I mean, one, of course, is the fact that in the last 10 years or so, it seems that we're discussing more and more the question of how to do the study of Islam. And so the question of method is pretty much central to a lot of people's concerns. So it speaks very well to that. But also, I mean, one can't fail to notice, and this is of course more acute in the US than here, the assault on diversity and inclusion. And in that sense, I mean, the timing of this, although of course I'm sure it was, you might not have expected things to have gone so badly so quickly in the US context, but it's a really important work for that reason as well, the context in which it has been published.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I did not expect things to have taken shape in precisely the way that they did. But, it is certainly the case that there are disappointing strands, I think, of Muslim community discourses around gender that actually align in really problematic ways with some of the conservative Christian and some of the white nationalist rhetoric around gender and community and things like that. And so I touch on this only very briefly in the book, but I do think that, there are some difficult conversations to be had among Muslims and among scholars who study Islam and Muslims, and those are obviously overlapping categories, about how to confront this new moment.
Yeah. And in some ways it kind of, I see what you mean by the difficulty of those conversations as well, because um, one's aware of the fact that politically also, um, just being a Muslim in many kind of contexts in the US and Europe is quite difficult. Being a Muslim man is even more kind of being under siege for all sorts of reasons, and of course, the classic kind of accusation which would come out is that there's an element of demonization going on there. And I'm sure you've well, I know for a fact that you've come across that, because I was following the Twitter conversations about this when you were writing the book. But that of course can make things extremely difficult in terms of your interaction with networks and with people you're engaging with.
Yeah, I mean, it really does. And I think that is, it's complicated, right? Because on the one hand, um, there is a cultural tendency in the US, certainly, and in places in Europe and so forth, to treat Muslim men as somehow uniquely or especially kind of patriarchal and misogynist. And that's just not, I think, reasonable, right? It certainly isn't. But at the same time, there are problematic um, approaches to the study of gender and Muslim women's scholarship that men from Muslim backgrounds in the academy are engaging. And so, how do you talk about that, right? How do you not scapegoat them for what is a much, much larger problem, but also be clear about where the particular problems lie? And I think this book, I hope, doesn't fall into that trap, in part because it criticizes a lot of people, right, for this work, right? So some of the folks whose textbooks come under scrutiny, or chapters about Islamic law that cite basically 98% men's work, right? um, these are not Muslim men. These are quite senior white colleagues in the academy, right, who kind of set the tone for some kinds of conversations. But it is and continues to be a problem, right, when scholars from Muslim backgrounds, scholars who explicitly claim Islam in their work, um, talk about things, talk about gender in ways that Muslim women colleagues have already written about it, and they don't cite that work, right? They don't acknowledge that it exists. They don't acknowledge that they're responding to it. They repeat things other people have already said, or they make arguments that have already been rebutted. And that's just not helpful. And it's especially not helpful when those are then the books that outsiders cite as, well, then this is the thing you need to read on this topic. And so it really, I think, doesn't do justice to what the scholarship looks like. And there are concrete professional harms, especially to junior colleagues whose work doesn't get cited, right? Especially with all of the increased reliance on algorithmic citation metrics and so forth, that being excluded from one thing means being excluded from this other thing, which means that you don't show up on Google Scholar, which means that your article isn't highly ranked, which means that it doesn't show up in lists of things to read, and so on and so forth. And then when somebody, wants to know your H index to see if you deserve to have tenure, it's a problem.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get a bit more into the book. So it seems that there are, I mean, there's obviously a diagnostic element to that, and one element of the diagnostic sort of, to show how there is, I guess, what one might call kind of structural sexism in the field,
Mhm.
um, is to look at the sort of citational indexical
Mhm.
element to that.
Mhm.
But um, at the same time, I think the point that I'm sure you'd want to make is that it's not merely about the indexical, right? It's not just about numbers. It's about, those numbers are reflective of attitudes and practices. Because I think, and reflecting on the Twitter kind of arguments, when you were writing this, I think people were very much focusing on the numbers and saying, oh, so and so is not being cited, or there's only like 98% of that article by Makdisi, cites male authors, and only 2%, and it doesn't give a sense of what's actually significant in the field and what the trends and so forth are, and as you said, the eradication of arguments and contributions. So if we can start with the diagnosis before we move to your reparative practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think the numbers are useful and not useful, right? So there's a very good article by a couple of feminist geographers that I cite in the book, Carrie Mott and Daniel Cockayne, and they talk about, um, I don't know if I'm going to be quoting them exactly here, but not sort of subjecting oneself to the regimes of accounting of the neoliberal university, right? Don't get sucked into the numbers, that you have to use qualitative measures, right? And Jen Jackson, who's part of the Cite Black Women Collective, writes about this, and she talks about structural inclusion, right? So it's not just, counting how many citations, it's thinking about who are you really engaging? Who are you thinking with, right? Whose scholarship are you attending to in meaningful ways? Who are you putting yourself in conversation with? And I agree completely that these things are very necessary. And yet, right, the numbers in a way are a starting point in that they make some things starkly clear, right, in a way that they otherwise might not be. So, if you look at Shahab Ahmed's What is Islam? It's more than 500 pages long, and it does not give a single example of a Muslim woman as a historical actor or cultural figure, right? Across the whole of it. Um, it just doesn't. It mentions Khadija and it mentions Qaya Sultan in passing, in sentences focused on their husbands or husband and father, right? And that's it. There are two literary characters, and the rest are all modern academics. Um, so you have a whole history of what is Islam and no women, right? So there's this new trend of like you write the history of international relations without men, or the history of art without men, which are reparative projects. But here we literally have the history of Islam without women. And the numbers are, I think, really helpful to that. But I also think that there are qualitative indicators too that can be really helpful. So if we look at the way scholars and scholarship get talked about, that gives us another reflection, a different reflection of how the field is operating. So in 2022, Lola Serrano and I published an article in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion where we did quantitative and qualitative evaluation of 15 years worth of JAR book reviews, right, which included the books on Islam, but not only the books on Islam. And our most striking findings, which were statistically significant, was that the language of esteem, being a leading or an eminent or a senior scholar, was very deeply gendered. terms like prominent and distinguished overwhelmingly applied to men. And when they were used for women, it was nearly always white women. And some of the clearest examples here came from Islamic studies. And in the book, in the Woman Question book, I also show how this works in a small sample of Islamic studies books. You find the male authors disagreeing at times quite sharply with other men in the field, but doing this sort of reflexive naming them, enumerating their qualifications, engaging substantively with their idea. My distinguished colleague so and so, regrettably, whatever, whatever, whatever. And the women with whom these authors disagree, or even sometimes women with whom they agree, are either relegated to the notes or just ignored, right? Not there at all. So if you didn't know the existing literature, right, you wouldn't know that this is something that has been written about at length someplace else by someone else. And again, within Islamic studies here, this is also often a place where gendered racism shows up, right? Where the male scholars who are named and cited or included in an edited volume or a journal special issue or a conference are fairly diverse and include men from Muslim backgrounds or men who explicitly claim Islam in their work. But the women, who are generally fewer in any case, are mostly white non-Muslims or sometimes white converts. And so this is a way that we see in sort of qualitative terms who is taken seriously as a scholar and who isn't. And that shapes how the work gets done.
Yeah. And in fact, I mean, you discuss that in different ways in the earlier chapters, and then of course you have the long chapter on representing Islamic studies, which in many ways I think is probably the central chapter in the book.
Oh, that's so interesting. Nobody else has said that, but I'm really
I
interested.
mean, I thought that was quite interesting because it seems to kind of like go sideways, but also it's it's almost kind of a reflection on your own practice as well and how you're seen. Because I think that is an important element of it. Because an intervention like this has to have a sort of a self-reflective element to it. But I mean, we can, as I said, we can talk. I don't know if you want to say something about that particular chapter, but I did want to ask you a bit more about the reparative practice beyond the.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would say about that chapter is that it is reflective, I think, of the way that people in Islamic studies, like people in the humanities and social sciences more broadly, but especially I think the humanities in the US, are constantly being asked to justify their existence, right? So writing a book about ninth century jurisprudence, um, people want to know, so what? Like,
Yeah.
being a good scholar, being a careful scholar, writing work that changes what we know about the past is generally considered insufficient to justify, um, almost anything, right? You've got to demonstrate your relevance. And it's certainly the case, obviously, that I have things to say about how Muslims today draw on the historical tradition, draw on a spiritual tradition, draw on a legal tradition, draw on an exegetical tradition. But being asked to kind of do public facing work with broader and often unsympathetic audiences is not something that when I started graduate school, I would have anticipated needing to do. And September 11th, of course, changed that for everyone. But the stakes are really different, right? It is certainly the case that women in general and women online and women of color in particular get just really gross, sexualized, violent feedback and threats in a way That applies outside of Islamic studies and even outside of academia. We see it with actors and sports figures and meteorologists, right? But I think that in the context of Islamic studies, it's sort of a perfect storm, where you have religion and gender and sexuality all sort of coming together. And it means that people often back away from those kinds of public facing opportunities because who has time for that, right? Um, you
And
give an interview to a journalist and then like there go your next 3 weeks because you're dealing with the fallout.
and it's particularly bad because, of course, um, especially nowadays in the field, in many ways, it really is about that public engagement. It's kind of unavoidable, and if you're really going to make a name for yourself, I guess, you do need to have that engagement. And if it becomes more difficult for certain people to do that because of the way in which they're being perceived, that's it's all the worse, actually, in many ways.
Yeah. Sarah Sobieraj, who has a really interesting book, the title of which I have lost to the fast, but I cite it in the book, talks about one informant who says she wants to be visible enough to influence the conversation, but not so visible that she becomes a target. And that's absolutely my motto at this stage.
Um, well, let me ask you then about the reparative practice, and in particular the your concluding beginner's guide. If you could talk us through that and how you think that will change things.
Well, I'm not sure that I think it will change things, but I certainly hope it will
Yeah.
change things. So the first thing here is that the first version of what became chapter 5, what became the conclusion, was actually much less specific to Islamic studies. And in fact, it is absolutely true that many of the things that confront us in Islamic studies are actually nothing to do with our field, right? It's the rise of the gig economy. I don't know what the situation is like in the UK, but in the US, about 3/4 of instructional positions today are off the tenure track, right? And for junior scholars, of course, the figure is higher. And pervasive sexism in academia means there are delayed promotion. If you even make it to the tenure track, it means that service loads are ridiculous, especially for women of color, to a lesser extent for men of color, for white women as well. There are, of course, specific things that relate to our areas of scholarly expertise, but a lot of what we confront and need to change is just within the academy broadly, right? So that is a thing to sort of have as a ground expectation, sort of going in. But in terms of thinking about concrete things people can do, um, I initially had it broken up by sort of your role. Are you doing something? Are you writing? Are you organizing, etc.? Are you being invited to do something, right? And ultimately, the way I've chosen to break it up has to do with peer review, with invitations. Um, I forget what the third thing is, and then with sort of what you're assigning in the classroom. For all of these, the
Citing and assigning.
citing, there you go. So, of course, so all of them begin with what I said earlier with noticing, right? Noticing what you're doing yourself, noticing in things you're reading, who are you citing, who aren't you citing, who are you naming in the text, who are you naming in the notes, but also if you're working collaboratively, right? Uh, who's on your team? Who's choosing who's on the team? Are you crediting scholars differently? Does everyone or no one get their earned titles on publications or in introductions? Um, who are the examples and who are the outliers, right? When you're giving examples to your class. Um, these aren't things where I'm trying to make anybody feel bad about where they are, but more sort of attuning yourself to what are our unconscious defaults, right? What
Yeah.
feels right, what feels comfortable, and how does that change? Um, I think another thing that I would say that is especially true for things if you're inviting people, if you're planning some sort of event, parity, inclusion is really mostly about planning, right? So
Yeah.
start early, network carefully, consult widely, be transparent, have contingency plans, leave yourself time to maneuver. And this is true, I guess, also for writing and citing and assigning, right? Leave yourself enough time so that you have that sloppy first draft and you can get feedback on it. That's obviously easier if you're more senior and you're not worried somebody's going to like take away your PhD when they see how bad your first draft is. Although I still sometimes worry about that. But have people that you trust to be able to use as a sounding board earlier in the process. Because when you get advice earlier in the process, you leave yourself time to course correct, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so an example where I didn't have time to course correct is when I did my Lives of Muhammad book, right? I organized that project around texts that ended up mostly being by men, right? I was most of the way through the research for this book before I realized that my seemingly extremely obvious story of using biographies of the prophet to understand the changing biography of the prophet meant excluding most work by women authors, especially Muslim women, who many of whom were writing about the prophet by writing about the women of his household, right? So a sort of form of indirect biography. Um, but we don't know what we don't know. And by the time I realized that was what was going on, I was able to bring in a few things, but not overhaul my research strategy, right? My research questions. Um, but we also don't know what we don't know. My student Atib Gul, who's now researching prophetic biography in Urdu while on a pre-doctoral fellowship at LUMS, has found two 20th century Sirah texts by women from the subcontinent that haven't been widely studied, that haven't been translated into English, that haven't been cited in a lot of other work, which also then points to other limitations of my project and more broadly the field, right? So it's an exciting discovery. I couldn't have known about it 10 years ago. But, this is, we all have to be, I think, comfortable with the provisional nature of our scholarly work. And I think, we have to be really suspect of purity politics, right? We've all perpetuated these kind of exclusionary dynamics in one way or another. And I think we have to get comfortable with nudging our colleagues to do better in their own work, with taking criticism of our own work, which is absolutely much easier earlier in the process than having it happen once the book is in print, or even gone to the printer might be worse, right? Because it's too late to do anything about it, but you don't have the satisfaction of it being done. Um, so I think these sorts of baby steps, right? Consultation, transparency, receptivity to critique, and a lot of tolerance of ambiguity, right? That this is something that we are all kind of working with, right? In the moment. This is not one person being a bad apple, right? These are our default habits, and unless we very consciously work to challenge them, they're not going to change.
And I think especially the point about the need for collaboration and just being a lot more aware of what's out there. Because, again, we tend to focus on particular languages and literature produced in particular languages and don't really necessarily think about what might be out there in different works. And even within that, there's both the privilege of English amongst European languages, but also very much a privilege of Arabic amongst the sort of languages which are used in the study of Islam as well.
Yeah, there's a note in Usman Khan's book Beyond Timbuktu that struck me as really telling in this regard. So he's talking about the way that even within West Africa, Francophone and Anglophone scholars are sort of talking past each other, right? That there are publications coming from within the same region, and they're just not, those scholarly networks are not in conversation, right? And people have limited time, people have limited energy, people have limited research budgets, people have limited library access, right? I mean, there are a lot of reasons why we read the things we read and don't read other things, and don't get invited to certain conferences and don't know about other publications. But more consultation, I think, and more explicit attention to what we're leaving out can be really helpful.
I
Yeah.
mean, I guess the question is are there ways in which we can kind of embed that in, for example, the way we train our students? Because I mean, I think lots of what you mentioned in that conclusion and which we've been discussing. The question is, yes, how do we actually embed that into a training program, or what would that mean in practice?
I mean, I think some of it is crowdsourcing comprehensive exam lists, right? If half the things on a list I'm providing to my student are things that I read when I was in graduate school, that's a huge red flag, right? I think that reading lists tend to be conservative, syllabi tend to be conservative, right? I mean, in a sort of conservation of energy principle sort of way, as opposed to out of any desire to, to stifle innovation or anything like that. So I think that we have to get comfortable with, updating ourselves. I think that book review editors should be asking, how are we choosing what books we review? Something close to 7 out of 10 of the Islam related books that were reviewed in the jar between 2006 and 2020 were by men. I don't think that's reflective of publications in the field. It is not reflective of the membership balance of the American Academy of Religion. And so thinking about why is that? How are certain decisions being made? So I think that those are good questions. There's a huge literature on citation, like a huge literature, some of which I cite in the book, but certainly not all of it. And I think that getting clear with ourselves about what are we citing and why is really important. Are we citing defensively, right? Do we expect that peer reviewers are going to expect that we've cited, the new IT book, and then we've framed our whole organization of the argument around them? Sarah Ahmed, who has a really terrific article on this on her blog, I think it's the Feminist Killjoy blog. She talks about it as, I'm also not going to remember. It's cited in the book, and
Yeah.
if I think of it, I'll put it in the chat. But she basically talks about going to this conference around reproductive freedom, and folks were organizing their, or maybe it was reproductive justice, folks are organizing their presentations around the work of white male philosophers, right? Even though it's a conference specifically around a gendered issue, and these aren't people who'd worked on it, right? But that's how you show you're serious, is you bring the theory in.
Yeah.
And the tendency to treat, and this has been written about extensively over the years, women's work as sort of empirical, but men's work as where you get the theory from, is a big problem.
And that's precisely the thing that I mean, decolonial kind of activists also point out, that there's a difference between the subjectivity of theory, which comes from a particular privileged group, and being an object of inquiry, which is something quite different, and you don't necessarily expect that object of inquiry to throw up something theoretically significant, which may be kind of used to reverse the situation. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm glad you sort of looped us back around to decolonial theory, because one of the things that has been raised at times as a critique of this um, project of looking at citations of women and paying attention to gendered dynamics in the field is, oh, but the real problem is, the plagiarism or the exclusion of scholars from the global South, which is, I mean, certainly a very real problem. And I have often not done well on that score. And it's not either or, right? I mean, there are also women in the global South, and some of the important decolonial work pays attention to this, but not all of it, right? So some of it does much better on the inclusion score in terms of scholars from global South contexts, but not a lot of women from those places. And it's a frustrating dynamic to be told that these things are pitted against each other when they shouldn't be.
Well, thank you for that. I think we should probably open it up at this point, because it's coming up to 6 o'clock. Well, it's 6 o'clock now. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions, and someone's already raised their hand. I'm just going to stop recording and then invite Yasmin to start this Q&A.